Good afternoon, everybody. Good lunch? Are you feeling energized? Good. Welcome to the climate change session. If you'd like to take your seats, we can commence the proceedings. Do you know, I did want to just note that conferences like this don't happen by chance. They don't happen by mistake. They take a great deal of organisation, and I just wanted to name check a few of my colleagues on the programme committee. I'm not going to name you all because it'd take a long time, but certainly I'd like to say Sherry, Justin, Darlene, and of course my colleague Rachel Burbidge. Thank you for your support in organising this climate change session. If I could have the climate change slide up, that would be great. Or do I just advance it like that? There, technology works. Over the last day and a half, we've been talking a lot about noise, local air quality, but now we're going to turn to climate change. Climate change is an existential threat, in my view, to aviation. And clearly, we just wanted to do a little introduction to this so that our esteemed panelists don't need to do an introduction to climate change. Yeah, it's pretty obvious, but it bears repeating. The consumption of fuel by aircraft emits greenhouse gases and non-CO2 emissions. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change say that approximately 2.4% of human emissions of CO2 come from aviation. That's based on an estimate back in 2018, and we're probably back to around about that level now. And of course, global air traffic demand is forecast to grow, and more flights in a do-nothing scenario means more emissions. We heard yesterday, I think it was something like we need to create 89 new pilots a day in order to deal with the demand that Boeing are expecting to see. But as an industry, we have a track record in reducing emissions, and we are in the process of implementing some challenging net zero carbon pathways. And I'm absolutely delighted to say that even though this is an existential challenge for aviation, existential threat, we have a stellar panel of experts who are going to talk about some innovative solutions to the CO2 and the non-CO2 challenges we face as an aviation industry. I'm going to hand over to Rachel now to introduce our first speakers.
Okay, that's working. Great, thank you, Ian. That was a really good introduction. I think that sets the scene nicely for what we're going to talk about for the next sort of hour and 20 minutes. So we have 4 presenters today, 3 with us in the room and 1 person joining us online. And it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Kenley Farmer. Kenley is a director at Airlines for America. Prior to this, she was Deputy Director for the District of Columbia's Department of Energy and Environment, responsible for a budget of $75 million and improving the quality of life for residents and natural inhabitants of the nation's capital. She has also been a program analyst for an affordable housing member organisation, a legal fellow for the White House Council, and spent 6 years working in litigation with Kellogg. And she's going to talk to us today about the various different measures that airlines can take to meet their decarbonisation targets. So thank you, Kenley. Over to you. Thank you.
And let's see, it's this button. We do this button. Okay. Well, hi, everybody. I hope everyone had a wonderful lunch, and thank you to Ian and Rachel for kicking us off for this session. Here we are in the 4th quarter of our conference. So as Rachel mentioned, my name is Kenley Farmer. I'm with Airlines for America. I want to thank UC Davis and our conference organizers for bringing us together, to Rachel and Ian for traveling so far to be here to help us stay on track. It's much appreciated, especially for these important conversations that we're having these few days. So for those of you that don't know, Airlines for America is the association that represents the major U.S. Passenger and cargo carriers. So if you flew to Palm Springs, it's highly likely that you flew on one of our carriers. I want to thank especially the previous presenters that have gotten us to this point of the meeting for their thought-provoking presentations. These are all difficult challenges, and I appreciate them outlining those challenges as well as potential solutions. I think that we learned during the pandemic the importance of coming together, the value of in-person discussions, in-person communication. So thank you to all of you for being here and being part of these important elements. So as we've discussed, decarbonization in the aviation industry is just extremely difficult. It's a big challenge. It's a difficult task, and there's no easy solutions. But I do believe that great challenges offer a wide range of opportunities for innovation, as well as revisiting the status quo. Before I dive into the slides, I just wanted to offer a little bit of framing from our perspective. So as I mentioned, I believe it's a very exciting time for aviation. We've seen these new advanced aircraft, discussions of moving away from just traditional jet fuel. I'll talk about that a little bit more. And the horizon, I think for me, there's some of these new aircraft that I think I only thought would be possible in some type of science fiction. So I think it's pretty incredible to see this as a possibility today. I also, appreciate Matt's comments yesterday about aviation being part of modern society and modern civilization. According to our data, as recently as 1971, there were only 49% of Americans had ever traveled commercially on a plane. And just 21% of those had done so in the past 12 months. But as of 2022, so post-pandemic, we have 87% of Americans who have traveled commercially, with nearly half having done so in the past 12 months. So I know for me in particular, it's something that is pretty easy to take for granted, that I can just jump on a plane, be in Palm Springs for this meeting, be on the other side of the world. I think it's a pretty incredible time to be a resident of this planet and be able to do that. This trend line has been steadily ticking up every year, and there's little reason to think that it will stop soon. The FAA estimates that it handles as many as 45,000 flights and 2.9 million passengers per day. The ability, as I mentioned, to just kind of go where you want to go. One of my favorite conversation topics is to talk about where you're traveling next, what your vacation is going to be, where you want to see next. So I think that's a great thing to dream about. In terms of economic impact, commercial aviation helps drive $1.25 trillion in economic activity and 10 million jobs in the United States. So as I mentioned, we're not only entering a new age of aviation, but also what's being called the fourth industrial revolution, as we move from steam to electricity, automated machinery, and now artificial intelligence. So with that broad context, I'll move into a little bit more detail in the slides. My goal here is just to give an overview of this kind of all of the above approach. I have these very talented co-presenters that will dive into the weeds a little bit more. But as I mentioned, it's a difficult issue, so I expect much more conversation on this to come. So the airlines have a strong environmental record, and there's a lot that's mentioned here that's already been mentioned in this conference, so I won't repeat others, but we have seen improved fuel efficiency over 145% from 1978 to 2022. And in particular, from 2000 to 2022, the fuel efficiency was 45%. But as I mentioned, there's still always more to be done. We're not stopping here. We want to continue to see that improvement for both particulate matter, all types of emissions, as well as greenhouse gas emissions. So the title of the presentation is All of the Above Approach. So I tried to kind of capture different categories of ways that we are trying to address climate change. So of course there's the technology. Aircraft is one of the most critical pieces of this puzzle. So new aircraft engines plus enhancements like winglets, research and development for breakthroughs, including alternative fuel aircraft, some of which we've already seen this week. And there's the operations themselves, so how weight is distributed on the plane, single engine taxis, renewable ground power at the gates, as well as we've seen a lot of transition towards electric ground support equipment, so the actual vehicles on the ramp. There's the infrastructure, so delivering 21st century air traffic control, the emissions reductions that can be gained in the air. Sustainable aviation fuels is a key part of the solution, so I'll talk a little bit in more detail on that. For now, it's liquid, so it's kind of a drop-in fuel for traditional jet fuel, but there's also electric, hybrid, or even hydrogen in the long term. We have another presenter today that will talk about non-CO2 impacts, so this is contrail mitigation and avoidance. This is an area where a lot of research is being done. It's very exciting to see what opportunities may be available for contrails. And then, as I mentioned, artificial intelligence. So we've seen this implemented for smart gating. So this will reduce your taxi times as you get to the gate, as well as reduce CO2 emissions. And then finally, carbon capture and storage is another element. So the US airlines have committed to net zero by 2050 in terms of CO2 emissions. And I'll continue on. So as I mentioned, a big piece of that will be sustainable aviation fuel. So for those of you that aren't familiar, this is a similar kind of renewable fuel base, taking, in this example, there's forestry waste, household waste, used cooking oil. There can be other feedstocks that may be implemented in terms of developing this fuel. It is blended with traditional jet fuel and then delivered to the aircraft. So this is kind of a bridge solution because it's available today. It's being used today in aircraft, but we do need to see ramp up in terms of supply. And we're very grateful to our federal partners on this. So you can see the logos down below on this SAF Grand Challenge roadmap. So we have US Department of Energy, Department of Transportation, USDA, EPA, all working with us to achieve this goal of 3 billion gallons of SAF per year in domestic sustainable aviation fuel production, with a larger goal by 2050. And part of that challenge includes these objectives. So it's expanding SAF supply and end use, reducing the cost of SAF so that commercial aviation remains affordable, enhancing the sustainability of SAF, which includes feedstock innovation, conversion technology innovation, building supply chains, policy evaluation analysis, enabling end use, communicating progress, and building support. And I think we could have a conference for almost any one of these bullet points if we wanted to. So as I mentioned, the theme of this is all of the above. I don't think there's going to be a silver bullet solution to decarbonizing aviation. So we want to consider all potential solutions. But the goal cannot be met without SAF as part of the transition. So the good news is we have seen an extreme uptick in SAF availability year by year, but we need to continue that level of growth and see kind of the hockey stick in terms of SAF production capacity. You know, some of our carriers have hired celebrities in C-suite level positions. So we have Oscar the Grouch here as United's Chief Trash Officer, which I think highlights the level of dedication and communicating to the public and the consumer what SAF is, why it's important, how it's valuable. Many of our carriers have set goals to meet 10% of their fuel requirements with SAF by 2030. Some have set a goal of 30%. And as I mentioned, airlines are already taking delivery of SAF. So this is something that's already happening, but we want to continue to see growth. Airlines are also working with their corporate customers, so to forge innovative agreements to allocate SAF Scope 3 emissions. So Scope 3 emissions have to do with the greenhouse gas protocol reporting, and help finance cost premium currently required to acquire SAF. United recently announced a program to give their customers the option to contribute to its new Sustainable Flight Fund, so you might have seen that option as you were purchasing your flights recently. And then we have public-private partnerships. So the Inflation Reduction Act was a huge boon to SAF in the United States. It includes a blender's tax credit, clean fuel production credit, and grants for SAF-related research projects. But we need more, just in terms of ensuring investor, I think, reliability and certainty. It'd be ideal if these tax credits were extended to at least a 10-year period, so that we continue to see some of the oil majors invest in this important technology. And then finally is funding for FAA and NASA R&D. So I'm sure many of you are already familiar with the Clean and Ascent efforts at FAA. We also heard from NASA earlier today, but here's a list of some of the other programs related to addressing many of these challenges, as well as the Sustainable Flight National Partnership, which enables 25 to 30% energy efficiency improvements in next generation transports. So this, as I mentioned, is very high level. I'm not sure what altitude we're flying at right now as I discuss these solutions, but I really appreciate your time today, and I'll turn over the rest to my co-presenters. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenley, for this really interesting presentation. I think it's really encouraging to see all the many measures that airlines are taking, and that you have really got this basket of measures approach to tackling decarbonisation. And we'll be able to talk about some of those a little bit more detail in the discussion. We will be keeping all questions to the end and then opening it up. So please do send your questions through Slido so we can be ready. And now we're going to hand over to our second speaker, Dinesh Sanekommu, who should be joining us online. Dinesh, are you there? Yes, hello.
Yes. Can you hear me all right?
We can, loud and clear. That's great.
Perfect.
So thank you for joining us today. Dinesh is a product manager for Google, where he leads their Google Research's Contrails team. This is a team that works across academia, industry, and other stakeholders to develop AI-based solutions for enabling contrail, the verification of contrail mitigation. He is a strong advocate for the responsible use of artificial intelligence and believes that it can play a vital role in helping mitigate and adapt to climate change. And he's going to talk to us today about how artificial intelligence can accelerate climate positive action. So Dinesh, thank you very much. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. And I'm very sad I couldn't be there in person. So I will dovetail off the previous talk. So I'm going to deep dive into the non-CO2 contrails topic, and specifically how artificial intelligence could accelerate climate beneficial action there. So maybe two disclaimers before I get started. If you hear my dog start to bark loudly, I will mute myself. So one, sorry for that. And then two, I will try to frame out why Google is talking about this space at all, because that's a common question we get in almost every conference or talk we go to. So I'll start with that before we get into the meat of the topic of contrails itself. So just to set the context, so again, I'm like Rachel said, I'm a product manager within Google Research, which is Google's R&D arm. So we focus on all sorts of technology. So when you think of Google, you probably typically think of Google Search, YouTube, Gmail, and all of Google Search actually started as a research paper. So my team and my broader team within Google Research, we focus on all sorts of areas of research. My team specifically at the intersection of AI and sustainability. So Google broadly has this ambition to reduce 1 gigaton of CO2 equivalent emissions annually by 2030. That goes well beyond our operations. So there's 3 pillars that we typically talk about our work. One is on the left-hand side, empowering individuals to take action. So these are things like in Google Maps, you might see a small green leaf to indicate that this is the most fuel efficient route for your type of vehicle or your type of engine. And then on the right-hand side, this is getting our own house in order, getting our operations to net zero. And then contrails, and a lot of our research actually falls in this middle bucket. So how can we work with our partners? So we'll talk a little bit about how we worked with American Airlines specifically, but how can we work with our partners and different customers to really get that scaled impact? So before we talk about contrails specifically, just to give you a sense, our projects, we typically categorize them, like everyone else, into mitigation and adaptation projects. So on the left-hand side, Project Sunroof is one of our mitigation projects where we use satellite imagery to help inform consumers and individuals of what is the solar opportunity for their house, so that they might reduce their reliance on fossil fuels. And then on the right-hand side, as we've seen over the last 2-3 years, wildfires have only increased in frequency and severity. So a critical part of mitigating and really becoming resilient to the truth and our new reality of larger and more deadly wildfires is early detection. So it turns out that the technology we built for self-driving cars and different things actually translate to these problems really, really well. So then how did we get into contrails? So our team works on kind of setting the stage. We have this ambition to work in the intersection of AI and sustainability. We already had some projects. And then actually back in 2021, we came across Mark Stetler's publication on contrails. Mark Stetler is a professor at Imperial College of London, and he published a paper that was talking about the effect of contrails and how if you adjust a small percentage of flights, there's potentially this huge climate lever. So that really catalyzed our interest in this area. And what we're looking at is the GWP 100 breakdown. So if you spread the warming from these different emissions over, explaining this to an audience that already knows this, but if you spread that over the 100 years, contrails still makes up, phenomenally a significant portion of total climate effect of aviation. So that's how we really got interested in the space, was actually reading one of the academic publications, doing more research, talking to different folks and partners in aviation. So what do we hope to do, or how can AI really help accelerate our understanding and potential mitigation of contrails? So the one-liner is, we believe that there's a way that computer vision, so that same technology that we applied to, the solar problem, the wildfire problem, we think there's actually a world where that same technology can help detect, so understand, as well as predict where contrails will form. So on the left-hand side, we're looking at a satellite image. So this is actually over the northern United States. There's a NASA satellite constellation. So we're looking at that image. And then on the right-hand side, we're looking at what a Waymo car actually sees, or kind of how a Waymo car might perceive the world. So what we did was we took the technology that we had already built within our company to figure out how a Waymo car might understand, this is a stop sign, this is a human, this is another vehicle, this is the speed limit. And we applied that to the satellite imagery. Could we really detect contrail formation? And could we really understand what was happening at a global scale? So just to give you, I always find this funny because people are like, oh, that must be really, really easy. But just to motivate how this might be a little complex and really get to the heart of what we're hoping to do. So it turns out even in YouTube videos or images on the internet that you'd like to search, there's tricky cases. Sometimes a puppy might look like a muffin, especially a group of muffins and a group of puppies. And even as humans, if we look at this really quickly, it might be a little tricky. Another example, I personally like this one a lot more than the the muffin example, but a baby sloth looks eerily similar to a chocolate croissant if you squint. So we as humans can do a good job at figuring these out. And then there are still some cases that are hard for us. So now when we talk about contrails, we're talking about naturally occurring cirrus on one hand, and then we're talking about contrail cirrus on the other hand. And I think that problem just probably for everyone in the room just got a lot harder. So that was the goal. Our hope and ambition was basically, okay, is there a way where we could still take that technology and see how we might increase our understanding of contrail cirrus? So we've been working on it for a couple of years, and now we're looking at a country level view of that same NASA satellite. And I think we're pretty confident now. So we have a few academic publications out as well with MIT and other folks, that it turns out that this might actually be a reasonable solution or a reasonable way to understand contrail effects at a global scale. So then that's the technical approach. That's some of the difficulty, and then ultimately what we were able to do. But let's talk about it in practice. So not just as a hypothetical exercise of what could technology or what could AI actually, what might it do? We can now talk about what we actually did. So after a year or two of research, we basically started a collaboration with American Airlines and Breakthrough Energy to see how we might apply this technology in a real world setting. So what we ultimately wanted to do is see if we could take all of the insights we learned and the technology we built and see if we could operate in a real world setting with live flights and avoidance regime and see if there's a measurable benefit. So what we're looking at is one example from that study we ran with American Airlines. We're looking at the EFB. So this is, again, what a pilot will have on their iPad. So what they saw as a news screen was a set of contrail forecasts. So this little gray blob was the predicted region that if that aircraft flew through it was very likely to create a persistent contrail. So the pilot from their EFB actually said, okay, I'll just fly under that region, and then to make up on the extra fuel of flying low, I'll actually be able to ascend a little higher. So they made that expert call. And then what we saw was then we could go back. This is a little difficult to interpret. So I'll just give you the one line purpose here. So it's not only sufficient to try and attempt something, we want to make sure on the back end, we can really verify what happened. So I think Rachel called out a lot of our focus is on verifying the success or basically the efficacy of any given contrail avoidance regime or test or experiment. So that's exactly what we did here. The pilot flew a different route. They went under. Then we were able to verify in satellite imagery after the fact, using, again, those same technical capabilities, whether or not that flight did make a contrail. So this is really messy from a human perspective because you see all the other flights, all the detected contrails, but it turns out this is something machines are really good at. So then the takeaway, again, this was a fairly small test, but we're really excited about it because it was the first per flight demonstration that contrail avoidance in a verifiable manner is possible. And it could be cost effective. So I think we need larger tests and we need more real world evidence, but it could be cost effective. And then what's next? So over the next year, I won't try to time box it. Just generally, what we'd like to do is we've tested these capabilities in the US airspace. I think we're excited this year to use some new European satellites that have gone up, and we're going to see how it might work in, let's say, a more dense European airspace like the Maastricht airspace. We're going to integrate some of these technologies into different pilot and dispatcher software. So hopefully you might be able to see this sooner rather than later. And then really we need more evidence. So our big ambition is that we ran a test last year, but our hope is this year is we can run an even larger test so we can start making, statistically significant kind of claims and understanding as far as the true cost efficiency and climate benefit of contrail avoidance. And that's all from me. So there's a link in here in the presentation, and I think you'll get it. So if you want to read more about the project or the papers, we post a lot of what we do on our website. And then always feel free to reach out to me as well.
Dinesh, thank you so much for a great presentation. And well, who knew we were going to get Oscar the Grouch, baby sloths, and chihuahuas in a climate change session? But it worked. Well done. I'm now delighted to introduce you to Ted Thrasher. Ted is he leads the environmental research and analysis projects at the MITRE Corporation, and throughout his career he's provided technical guidance to many high-impact modelling and simulation efforts. Worked on the FAA's airport air quality emissions and dispersion modelling system, the subsequent multi-scale aviation environment design tool, which I know many of you will be familiar with. Ted has previously served as Chief Environmental Standards at ICAO. He was responsible there for all activities relating to setting international standards and policies for aircraft environmental performance. He also led the development of ICAO's guidance material and support tools for the quantification of aviation's environmental impact. Ted holds a Bachelor of Science degree in aviation from an Ohio State University and a Master of Science degree in Systems Engineering from Johns Hopkins University, and is a former flight instructor. Very, very well qualified to talk to us about enhancing aviation environmental performance through improved decision-making. Could you join me in welcoming Ted?
Ian, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm very excited to be able to share some information about some research that we've been doing in this area. And it's pretty incredible. I was thinking about it on my trip out here to Palm Springs. I live in Tampa. And thinking about how it's been 20 years since the first time I came to this symposium. And 20 years ago was the first year that it made the switch from being just the noise symposium to the noise and emissions symposium. And then here we are today talking about climate change. So we've really come a long way in the last 20 years. So I think you guys have all gotten the message at this point. We've had this introduced quite a few times, that the Earth is getting warmer. Humans are responsible for that, and aviation contributes in a few key ways to that warming. CO2 emissions that come from the combustion of fuel. One thing that we hadn't heard about today, but black carbon or particulate matter emissions, that's also an effect and something that you see in airplane exhaust. And then the last item, persistent warming contrail formations, which Dinesh talked about. One key thing to keep in mind with contrails, you can see in the IPCC conclusions there that it does have a net warming effect from contrails, but the contrails that we're really concerned about from a warming perspective are those that persist after dark. So it's in the nighttime, that's when you're trapping in the heat. You know, daytime contrails could potentially have a net cooling effect, but you know, the ones you want to mitigate for sure would be the nighttime contrails. If we take a look at what's happening over in Europe, there was an update last year related to the European Union emissions trading system, where they launched an initiative to start looking at the non-CO2 effects on climate from aviation, and with a goal of coming up with a framework for how they're going to do monitoring, reporting, and verification for those non-CO2 effects in 2025. So that is right around the corner. One of the things that you'll see is that it gets to be really challenging if you want to try to look at all of these things together, though. So the contrails, they're going to cause warming during the nighttime hours. They don't always persist. So if you see an aircraft flying and it has a contrail that appears and then disappears right away, it's not really a climate effect there. When you're doing your modeling and your analysis, you need to account for where they are created. And in terms of the effects, you know, they're going to have a warming effect on the order of hours. If you take a look at black carbon or the particulate matter, that's very sensitive to the fuel composition. It's sensitive to the engine design, the combustors that are used, the power setting that's used. And again, you have to account for where it's released, and you know that those emissions, they can hang out for days to weeks. So it's definitely a little bit of a different time scale. CO2 emissions, they always cause warming. They're a well-mixed gas, so it doesn't matter where they're released. You don't have to worry about you know, where you're releasing it. But the warming effect from carbon dioxide lasts for centuries. So it's a real challenge if you're going to try to make that trade between, okay, if I do something that's going to cause an increase in CO2 emissions so that I avoid creating the contrail, how are you going to get the balance right so that you don't end up having an overall negative consequence? So that's why I wanted to talk a little bit about how, you know, the silos that we've had that have been necessary for doing the fundamental research to understand, you know, what type of operational adjustments can you make to avoid forming contrails? How can you adjust your flight plans to reduce your fuel consumption? How do you set emission standards for engines to reduce the particulate matter? That's great for fundamental research. But in terms of overall sustainability, if you don't look at them together, you can really end up making some bad trades. So I've got a few examples here. Let's say you make the choice to fly at a lower altitude to avoid forming that contrail. The air is a little bit warmer, no contrail is going to form. Well, now your fuel burn and your CO2 emissions have gone up. You might end up with a little bit lower particulate matter, but then the cost to the airline, because of the increased fuel burn, is going to go up. Let's say you pick a higher altitude to reduce your fuel consumption. Well, maybe now you've put yourself in a zone where you're going to form a contrail the whole time. Your fuel burn, your CO2 emissions went down. You've added some particulate matter emissions. You save some cost for the airlines. Or maybe your objective was to fly at a higher speed so that you could meet your schedule. So the contrail is going to happen regardless. You know, it either will or it won't, depending on what altitude you're flying at. If you're flying faster, you're burning more fuel, it's more CO2, you've got more PM, and you've increased your costs. So we believe that integrating these factors together can really have a multiplicative effect. So if you take a look at the contrail formation, the CO2 emissions, your particulate matter emissions, and you put it all into an integrated climate metric alongside of operating costs, that can allow you to improve your decision making. So we did try this out. We put together a system where we started by establishing what metrics we were going to use, what parameters we would need, the equations to be able to do all those calculations. and then use that in addition to information on where we thought contrails were likely to form and persist, looking only at those flights where they would be having contrails that would persist into the nighttime hours. And then we worked with a major airline to leverage their software to minimize the overall climate effect, but within their operational needs. And this is where we're trying to get that transition out of the research phase and into something that can actually be put into practice. And so in the end, we were able to present our environmental metric alongside of the cost so that the airline could make some improved decision making. So talk just for a minute here about the trial that we conducted just to evaluate the feasibility of the approach. So an airline will start the flight planning process for a flight at about 2 to 4 hours pre-departure. So that's when they've got their latest weather forecast information. They can start planning the route that's going to take advantage of the most favorable winds, avoid areas of turbulence and that kind of thing. And so we looked at that same time frame, worked with the dispatch at the airline, and we identified those areas where there would likely be persistent contrails that were going to form. We only looked at the evening and nighttime departures for the airline. And then used that to, based on the airline's schedule and the routing that they had historically used to go between those different city pairs, we identified a set of flights that would be candidates for making some potential adjustments to reduce the contrail formation. Then the airline, just business as usual, prepared the flight plans the way they were planning to fly it. And then armed with this additional information, they prepared an alternative set of flight plans that exclusively used altitude changes to minimize the time that they spent in the forecasted contrail producing regions. So the idea is it wasn't avoid contrail formation at all costs, and it wasn't take a wild, long detour around the contrail formation region because we knew that that was going to end up blowing up the CO2 emissions. So just use your system to come up with an optimized solution that is going to minimize the time in the contrail producing region. So here's an example for a single flight. So the way you look at these plots here, the relative humidity in the upper atmosphere, the higher the humidity, the higher the chances are that you're going to have a contrail that's going to be created and that it's going to persist. And then we're showing our warming effect in the plots below. So this is the effect on the climate. And you can see what the airline had originally planned, and they had the flight cruising at flight level 360 and then had to climb to flight level 380 further along the route. And in the mitigated flight plan, their flight planning software determined that, yeah, actually, we could do that climb a little bit earlier, take us out of that zone where we were going to create the contrails there in the box, and fly it that way. And so for that flight, we've got some results here. So the energy forcing is the metric that we use, and we look at it over 2 different time scales. We look at it over a 20-year time scale, so what's the warming effect going to be on the climate over 20 years, and then we want to look at 100 years. And the idea is you want to make sure that your results are going down in both cases. So that way you're sure you're not making a bad trade. So you can see what they had originally filed and the results there in terms of what the warming effect was going to be. And then we compare it against the mitigation case. And so you can see that we got a big savings from reducing the time in the contrail forming region. And in this case, because they started their climb a little bit earlier, they actually saved a little bit of fuel. So it was actually win-win. The negative trade from the airline was that it actually caused the flight to take a little bit longer to get to the destination. But that is the reality. In this case, a 1-minute trade is probably reasonable, right? So 1 minute longer, saved some cost, saved some fuel, and everything worked out. So now that we've demonstrated that the approach is feasible, we've got a couple of things that we're focusing on. Our next round of work in this area is really focused on areas that could benefit the near term. So just like we heard in Dinesh's presentation, we want to understand the uncertainties and the limitations of the available meteorological data. So we're doing an analysis to understand what are the uncertainties with the forecast humidity, how suitable is that humidity as a predictor of persistent contrail formation. And then we're also looking at how can we take what we learned from the pre-flight planning trial and put that into something that could go into practice today to really give airlines and aircraft operators the ability to make improvements today, not having to wait for a new system, but what does the information sharing mechanism look like so that you can get information from the airline, from the AOC, up to the pilot regarding their route preferences so that they can improve their environmental performance within the constraints and the realities of running a business. We're also looking to the future. And I'll close with the thought that we really feel that further integration is going to have an even greater multiplicative effect. So we've demonstrated that if you look at contrails, CO2 emissions, particulate matter emissions, you bring it all together in an integrated climate metric, look at your costs and your business objectives, you can improve decision making. But if we want to scale this up to the national level or to the global level, the future is a concept called trajectory-based operations. We haven't talked about that too much today, but that is a future concept where you've got information sharing between the airline, the pilots, and air traffic management so that everybody's on the same page. It promises to offer a number of benefits: increased throughput, improved flight efficiency, increased predictability of schedules, and also increased operator flexibility, including the flexibility to make some adjustments as you get updated information on where contrails are likely to form so that you can minimize your time in that region. So I'll close with that thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ted. And I find it very reassuring that MITRE, along with Google, are bringing their intellectual and computational heft to an important problem like contrails. And it makes me reflect that it's only a few short years ago that we weren't really talking about contrails. And I think that's a great thing about this conference, is it moves with the trends in environmental impact. So that's great. I'm delighted now to introduce my friend and colleague, Jonathan Bagg, a fellow air navigation service provider representative. He is the Director of Stakeholder and Industry Relations